mere 200 years ago, winds and ocean currents drove European navigators to an enormous island in the great Southern Ocean, the continent of Australia. They were about to enter a living museum of natural history. These discoverers had sailed from a hemisphere crowded with many continents. Unknown to them, when they stepped ashore, they were making contact with a land that had been isolated from the rest of the world for many millions of years. The animals of this new land, too, had existed in isolation for a vast period of time. These early explorers were soon to encounter animals the likes of which they had never seen before. Animals that to them were improbable. In the continent's long isolation, the animals had developed in ways that produced species different from those anywhere else in the world. In this land of light and sun, the early explorers and settlers found not only a strange collection of birds and beasts, but also a land that to them was like another planet. It was dry and hot, it was flat and infinite, and the animals were its alien inhabitants. In Australia, there are an enormous number of animals existing in different environments that have been constantly varying over time. The mystery of Australia's unusual animals is in the changing nature of the land and climate. Australia today is different from what it was at the time of European discovery. In the distant past, it was completely different. The intriguing story of Australia's animals is to be found by going back into the past. Back beyond the Romans, their powerful conquests and mighty empire. Back beyond the Greeks and their gods. Beyond the Egyptians and their timeless monuments. Beyond the appearance of mankind on Earth. Beyond the age of the great dinosaurs. Beyond the beginnings of life in the sea, its emergence onto land, and the ancient forms of plant life. Back to the time of the birth of land. Before life, there was fiery chaos as the lands of the earth were forged in a volcanic furnace. The earth's molten center spewed out cascades and rivers of flowing rock, which settled into red seas of lava. $225 million years ago, all the continents were united as a vast landmass called Pangaea, including Australia. Gradually, due to forces deep under the Earth, it was forced apart, forming two supercontinents. Then the southern supercontinent, Gondwanaland, broke up, releasing Africa and India into the vast prehistoric oceans. Australia, South America, and Antarctica remained attached. Then, about 45 million years ago, Australia broke free and began drifting north. For 30 million years, Australia was isolated in the vast Southern Ocean. It became a drifting museum of animals, free to evolve independently from the rest of the world. During the millions of years of continental drift, the fringes of the world's landmasses were taking shape. Sculpturing of the crust went on as it buckled and twisted under enormous pressures of continental plate movement. Plants began to colonize Earth's barren landscapes. Over vast periods of time, dense forests took over what was once bare rock, offering support for the first forms of animal life on land. The stage was set for the emergence of a multitude of strange and primitive creatures. In turn, these creatures gave rise to the ancient giants of the animal kingdom. It was the age of dinosaurs. On the land that became Australia, variations of the giant Tyrannosaurus and Brontosaurus challenged and competed for survival. During the dynasty of the dinosaurs, animals of more humble size darted, hid, and slithered through the undergrowth at the feet of the giants. A catastrophe changed the old order. Possibly because of meteors colliding with the Earth, debris and dust were hurled into the atmosphere, blocking out the sun. The environment was dramatically altered. Many animals, including the magnificent and massive dinosaurs, were unable to adapt to a new world. The land became littered with the bones of the largest creatures the Earth had ever known. The passing of the dinosaurs was the end of an era, but with a changing environment came a new dawn of opportunity for other life forms on Earth. The animals that inherited the Earth were the mammals. In Australia, the mammals that dominated were different. These were the marsupials, mammals with pouches for carrying their young. For 30 million years, they evolved on an isolated continent, a drifting museum. For millions of years, Australia was home to only two groups of mammals. One of these comprises hundreds of species. They are the marsupials, or pouched mammals. The other group is the monotremes, the spiny anteater or echidna, and the platypus. The monotremes are uniquely Australian. They have a 100 million year history going back to the time of the dinosaurs. Until recently, almost nothing was known of the ancestors of Australia's mammals. Then, in an opal mining area in the barren outback, a strange object was found. It was to be the crown jewel of Australian fossils. This was the jawbone of an animal that died, was covered by silt, then transformed into opal. The creature that chewed with these teeth was a mammal that shared the earth with the giant dinosaurs. Possibly the animal looked something like this. It was only the size of a cat and is believed to be a common ancestor of the platypus and echidna. These species are the only animals that suckle their young like mammals, but lay eggs like reptiles. Being a mixture of reptile and mammal, they are often considered primitive. But primitive or not, they survived 100 million years of dramatic changes. Platypus occur in many of the permanent streams and billabongs in eastern Australia. With its duck bill and its beaver-like tail, the platypus is certainly the most improbable of all the Australian animals. Unlike the water-dwelling platypus, the echidna has a wide range of habitats. It occurs over most of Australia and is adapted to the extremes of snow country and desert. Though not an aggressive animal, the echidna is good at defense. The echidna has no particular habitat requirements. All it asks for is an adequate supply of ants and termites. The modern echidna has an ancient extinct relative, which was very similar in appearance, but was more than 10 times bigger than today's echidna. While Australia was isolated, the marsupials, unlike the monotremes, diverged into many different forms. But what did Australia's first marsupials look like? They are thought to be like today's bandicoots. And the first kangaroo was similar to this living musky rat kangaroo, a relic of what kangaroos were like 15 million years ago. Today's common ringtail possum resembles the ancestor of about 70 living possum species in Australia. The ringtail possum is a long-term resident of the forests, much like another familiar Australian, the koala. The koala has no tail, unusual for a tree-dwelling marsupial. This could mean that its ancestors were once ground-dwelling animals, and that through the course of evolution, they returned to the trees. Today's koalas are clearly adapted to life above the ground. Koalas breed once a year and produce only one young. The cub first lives in its mother's pouch, then on her back, until it is old enough to make its own way through the treetops. In prehistoric times, there were many types of koalas. Compared to its past glory, the koala lineage is now in the twilight of its reign. In the forests of Western Australia lives a rare animal that is the last surviving member of its lineage. It is one of Australia's most precious and beautiful marsupials. The numbat is unusual amongst the marsupials in that it has no pouch. It feeds exclusively on ants and termites, and because it is active during the day, it must be constantly alert for predators. There is another unusual marsupial found in Western Australia. It is the honey possum. The honey possum is amongst the most specialized mammals in the world, as it only feeds on pollen and nectar. With a brush-tipped tongue, the possum licks up pollen and nectar and scrapes it off in its mouth against tiny teeth. Actually, the honey possum is not a possum at all, but the sole survivor of an ancient and unique animal group. Evidence of its ancestors has never been found, so the honey possum's evolutionary story remains a great mystery. Tracks in the sand are usually all that is seen of a rare marsupial that spends most of its life underground. The marsupial mole. It is blind and has virtually no ears. As it lives in sandy deserts, it cannot build tunnels, but literally swims through the sand. The marsupial mole, like the numbat and honey possum, is the sole survivor of a unique marsupial group. It is amongst the mangroves and mudflats that one of Australia's evolutionary eccentrics is found. It is a fish that ventures onto the land. The mudskipper abandons the water for short periods to lurch and lumber about on land and performs antics surpassing any other fish. Australia's isolation influenced the evolution of birds to a lesser extent than mammals. The flightless birds were the most affected. The prehistoric-looking cassowary occurs only in the rainforests of Australia and New Guinea. Being stocky and flightless, it is thought to be a relative of some of the largest birds that have ever lived. It's suggested that the function of the cassowary's distinctive helmet is for protection while crashing head down through dense forest undergrowth. Cassowaries are also aggressive, and it seems that the helmet is used during fights and scurries between individuals. Beneath the calm, peaceful waters of tropical Australia exists a creature straight out of the age of the dinosaurs. This living dinosaur is the primeval-looking crocodile. The freshwater or Johnston's crocodile is unique to Australia and lives in the creeks, rivers and lakes of the tropical north. Totally at home in the water and often revealing only its eyes and nostrils, the freshwater crocodile can stay submerged without breathing for up to 2 hours. The long, powerful jaws of the freshwater crocodile and trap-like teeth can make an easy meal of any fish, small reptiles, and even mammals. But the freshwater crocodile is timid and not dangerous to humans. Away from the freshwater rivers and creeks of inland Australia, in the estuaries and coastal lakes, is found Australia's other living dinosaur. It is the estuarine or saltwater crocodile, one of the largest and most dangerous crocodiles in the world. The estuarine crocodile really is a giant, growing up to 8 meters in length and living up to 100 years of age. Coming ashore to nest, the female lays its eggs in large grass mounds. The newborn crocodile breaks out of the hard-shelled egg by using its specialized egg tooth. Once hatched, it is immediately independent of its mother and must survive any danger alone. Predatory birds and mammals are a constant threat. The estuarine crocodile needs only 1 meal a week. It will tackle turtles and even buffalo. Anything that comes near the riverbank risks attack. Estuarine crocodiles now live near Australia's north coast. Once they were widespread and even existed in the center of the continent. Sand dunes, saltbush and spinifex, deserts stretching to the horizon, dry lakes as vast as seas. This is the interior of Australia today. But 15 million years ago, it was a very different place. The dry center of Australia was once green and tropical. There were inland lakes like seas, fed by permanent flowing rivers. The lakes and swamps supported animals such as crocodiles, turtles with horns, flamingos, and even freshwater dolphins. Vegetation was lush and green. Dense tropical forests covered much of central Australia, and living in these forests were giant tree-dwelling marsupials, primitive ringtail possums, and huge flightless birds. The history of Australia's environment is a story of tropical paradise lost. As the Australian continent drifted and changed position on the globe, atmospheric conditions and ocean currents changed. This affected the climate, with temperatures falling and rainfall decreasing. The dense, wet forests began to diminish, and the ones to go first were those of the interior of the land. Australia was drying out. The landmass had been drifting northwards for about 30 million years. About 15 million years ago, the Australian and Southeast Asian continental plates collided. The New Guinea highlands were born. The enormous forces involved buckled the land and pushed up mountains. A lush rainforest environment was preserved in high altitudes to the north. Going up to the highlands of New Guinea is like taking a zoological time trip back to Central Australia 15 million years ago. The rainforests of New Guinea became a sanctuary for animals very similar to those that existed in Central Australia 15 million years ago, but have now died out. The moss forest ringtail survives in New Guinea. Ringtail possums are a very ancient group of animals that evolved in rainforests, so it is not surprising that 8 species occur there. The country's smallest ringtail possum is the pygmy ringtail. Both the moss forest and pygmy ringtails build nests of twigs, moss and leaves to protect themselves from the cold of the high rainforests. While the ringtails are primitive animals, there is a group that evolved more recently. They are called cuscus, and there are 7 known species. One of the rarest members of the group, Stein's cuscus, has only been found in one place, an oak forest in the highlands near the Irian-Jaya border. The silky cuscus has adapted well to life in the highest of New Guinea's forests. Its soft, luxurious coat gives it its name and also protection against the cold and drizzling rain of the mountain peaks. There are few places in the world where mammals of this size have remained hidden to science. Almost certainly there are cuscus in New Guinea that are yet to be discovered. New Guinea retained its rainforests and also many of its tree kangaroos. When such forests dwindled in Australia, most of these kangaroos were lost. Today, very few of the rainforest animals can be found in Australia, but some of their relatives survive in small tropical areas in the northeast. In Central Australia, the environmental change was so traumatic that animals had to adapt or die. The rainforest species, along with their habitat, have long gone. Although those animals disappeared, there are still remnants of the great forests that once covered much of inland Australia. Living rainforest relics, such as palms and the prehistoric cycad, still cling to life, rooted in a seemingly alien environment. These few shady valleys are prehistoric oases of the Australian desert. The plants stand isolated, as if transplanted from another era. If the environments of Australia were so different millions of years ago, how different were the animals that depended on them? To find out what the ancient animals were like, we need to search beneath the earth, in caves. Millions of years ago, animals lived and died in the forests and plains of Australia's interior. Some of them died near large rivers, and floodwaters carried their remnants into the depths of limestone caverns. Entombed within the deep flood deposits are the bones of animals that lived in prehistoric times. Here, protected from weathering, skeletal remains can preserve for millions of years, providing a clue to the identity of extinct animals. In some caves, bones and teeth have been found that are evidence of the existence of amazingly big animals. And these animals had pouches, just like Australia's modern marsupials. Such animals are from the age of the megamarsupials. One of the most spectacular of the megamarsupials was an animal whose scientific name is Diprotodon opatum. It was the size of a hippopotamus and was the largest marsupial the world had ever known. It can be assumed from the teeth of the Diprotodon that it was a giant grass-eater. Wombats may be the closest living relatives of this non-aggressive animal. The largest of the Diprotodons, weighing a ton, would have been about 35 times the weight of today's wombat. There once existed giant, short-faced kangaroos, the ultimate being Procoptodon. The largest of all surviving marsupials are the red and grey kangaroos, but these are wallaby-sized compared to the kangaroos that once abounded in Australia. Not only did giant versions of the ground-dwelling kangaroos exist in Australia, the present-day kangaroos that climb awkwardly through the branches of trees, feeding off leaves and fruit, are only several times bigger than the koala. There were prehistoric kangaroos that lived in trees, but were more than twice the size of their living descendants. Not all extinct megamarsupials left living descendants. Some disappeared completely from the earth, leaving nothing but bones. Marsupials are known for their timid nature, but there was an exception. The bones of an animal were found in caves in Australia that didn't quite fit the reputation. This is the skeleton of a most remarkable creature. It is a marsupial, but the teeth were not used for eating grass and chewing leaves. They were used for piercing and ripping open flesh. The animal was the marsupial lion, or Thylacoleo. It was about the size of a leopard and behaved in much the same way. This killer of the night filled a similar niche in Australia as did the big cats in Africa. Other animals of this era, such as the short-faced kangaroos, would have lived in fear of this aggressive predator. The marsupial lion terrorized the prehistoric kangaroos and other animals for well over 2 million years. It was the last tree-living carnivorous mammal to ever inhabit Australia. The marsupial lion lived off the giant herbivores, then died off with them into oblivion. The reptiles of Australia had their ancient giants. Today's goannas and parentes are descendants of a creature that roamed Australia 15 million years ago. The largest goanna in Australia is about 2 meters long. Its prehistoric relative measured 5 meters. Megalania, as it is called, was the world's largest lizard. The emu is a giant amongst today's birds, but there was a giant emu that was the heaviest bird that ever lived. Known as Dromornis, it weighed 500 kilograms, more than the weight of 6 people. Dromornis probably inhabited rainforests, but its living descendant adapted to woodland and grassland as it became more common. The ancestors of today's animals, those magnificent giant creatures that once lurched across the prehistoric Australian landscape, are no more. All that remains, preserved in limestone catacombs, are a few bones. Somewhere between 30,000 and 20,000 years ago, all the giants became extinct. At this time, Australia became more arid. Was it the shrinking waterholes and dying plants that stressed the animals to a point of no return? Could Aboriginal activities have contributed to the extinction of the megafauna, either directly by hunting or by alteration of the environment by their burning of vegetation? Whatever the causes, with the death of the mega marsupials, the world had lost forever the largest marsupials that ever lived. As forest gave way to woodland, sunlight penetrated the canopy of leaves, and plants of the understory began to thrive. Prehistoric rainforests had a continuous canopy, like a highway in the sky for the tree-dwelling animals to travel on. When the forests thinned out and this canopy was lost, how did the arboreal animals get from tree to tree? Evolution came up with the answer. Over millions of years, possums developed a membrane between their legs and arms. This enabled them to glide from tree to tree. An ancient form of today's ringtail possum is probably the ancestor of Australia's largest glider, the greater glider. The greater glider is solitary and territorial. The tiny sugar gliders of today, unlike the greater glider, nest in groups of adults and young. Although they are sociable animals, they tend to forage alone for their food, which is mainly sap and nectar. Sugar gliders evolved from a different line of possums than the much larger, greater glider. Gliding must have been a successful adaptation, because many ancient possum groups developed the ability. But the one that developed it to the greatest degree was the yellow-bellied glider. As the woodlands receded and trees became more sparse, the grasslands started to spread throughout the Australian continent. It was in areas such as these that the largest of all the marsupial groups evolved. They are called macropods, which literally means big feet. It is the group consisting of the kangaroos and wallabies. All the kangaroos and wallabies sprang from small forest-dwelling animals no bigger than cats. These animals were the primitive bettongs and potoroos. They are different from the large kangaroos and wallabies, not only in size, but by the fact that, surprisingly, they will eat meat. One of the largest of these primitive animals is the rufous bettong. Spending much of its time digging for roots, insects and worms, the rufous bettong takes full advantage of its ability to eat both animal and plant matter. As grasslands increased, the animals which could exploit this more abundant food supply had the upper hand. The large kangaroos and wallabies developed a stomach similar to sheep and cattle, a multi-chambered one containing microorganisms to help digestion. This stomach opened up a whole new menu of grass to the kangaroos and wallabies and played a major role in their ability to thrive all over the Australian continent. The kangaroos and wallabies became one of the most successful families of animals to ever inhabit Australia. As Australia continued to dry out and more areas were overtaken by desert, there evolved a group of animals well adapted to survive the severe conditions. It was a family of marsupials called the dasyurids. But there is something different about these animals. They are all ferocious flesh eaters. Like Africa with its big cats, Australia also has its carnivores, but these hunters of the night are all minute in size. Their food is not just a source of nutrients, but also of water, because many of these animals rarely drink. The dasyurids have a deceptively timid appearance. They prey mainly on insects and spiders, but will also tackle animals bigger than themselves, such as rodents, reptiles, and birds. Perhaps their greatest ability is adaptation to arid areas, which has allowed them to exploit the vast deserts that today form the main part of Australia. Australia has changed much throughout its history. Where now there are shifting desert sands, there were once lush primeval forests. The wondrous animals of Australia were shaped by the isolation and changes of this land. Knowing the story of Australia's animals of the distant past helps us to appreciate their preciousness and care for their future.